the African Studies Center, together with ZAM. And ZAM is an online journal about Africa, published in the Netherlands. Many of you will know ZAM. It's a newsletter. It brings investigative journalism, photography, and contemporary art. And its opening statement is, it's not about Africa, it's about all of us. And I like that statement. I'm happy to welcome Bart Luijrink. Bart, where are you? Bart is one of the engines behind ZAM magazine. And Bart has a long history in the anti-apartheid movement in the Netherlands, the AABN in particular. I would also like to welcome a few guests of this evening in particular. We welcome Anna Maria Yoyodzi from the South African Embassy. We welcome our board member representing the board of the African Studies Center, Hans Opschoor. Welcome. We welcome the Netherlands Association of African Studies and his chairperson who is representing that esteemed association, Felix Ameka. We welcome Peter Hermes. Peter has been the former director of NISA, and everyone knows NISA. And we also welcome Ruud van der Hurk of Action Aid, who is his successor. At least NISA became part of Action Aid. Where are you? There, all the way. We welcome Cor Groenendijk, the former chair of Kairos Foundation. We welcome Nelke van der Lans. Nelke, who was so active so many years as a coordinator of the Zandpad program here in the Netherlands. We welcome Jan Draaisma and Frauke Draaisma-Buikema. Where are you? Suddenly we see a lot of you here. Welcome again. You were so important for the Eduardo Mondlane Foundation. We welcome Robert Ross. Robert is professor of Leiden University's History Department and a specialist on South African history. And with Robert, Leiden University is represented. The university that gave, and many others as well from Leiden University, but that university gave an honorary doctorate to Nelson Mandela in 1999. Who was there in this audience? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So all of you who want to share some histories or some stories about that event, please go to these 4 people who've been there. The African Studies Center has a long history of studies and documentation about South Africa and about Nelson Mandela. 2 of our members of staff who know the area very well regret that they can't be here tonight due to illness. Jan Bart Gewalt and particularly Stephen Ellis. Recently, Stephen published his book about the ANC in exile, in which he could prove that Nelson Mandela has been a prominent member of the South African Communist Party. In last week's Sunday Times, the editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, used that book as a major element of his well-read column. And Stephen just emailed me to say that now, at last, also the South African Communist Party confirmed Mandela's membership this week, for the first time. And in a letter to the editor of the day before yesterday, Stephen added in the New York Times that it would be good if now, at last, the United States government would now also admit its role in the arrest of Mandela in August 1962. Another prominent member of our staff is Ineke van Kessel, and although slightly handicapped, she could come here tonight, and she has also been interviewed numerous times during the last few days. Ineke wrote a biography about Nelson Mandela. The book was there. You could still buy the book, I think. And Ineke did her PhD research about the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa itself. So welcome, Ineke. We are very happy that you could come. And you're a celebrity now, isn't it? Harry Wells, Harry, where are you? Is another committed South Africanist working at our center, but also connected to the Free University, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And that was a troubled history. There are more people here from the Free University who can tell about that trouble. But of course, on the one hand, in the history of the Vrije Universiteit, there was this link to the Afrikaner community. And on the other hand, there was a lot of support also from the Free University for the struggle. So, competition, a lot of it, during those years. Ineke and Harry will be the main speakers tonight, and Bart and Ineke will lead a panel discussion in which also Felix and Yinka will participate. Yinka is a scholar working at our center. Our Deputy Director, Jos Dame, will briefly tell us some background of the famous song, Free Nelson Mandela. And Carina van der Walt, Carina, where are you? There, all the way. You will read a poem for Mandela. Next to Ineke, Harry, Jan Bart and Steven, the African Studies Center once also had Klaas de Jonge as part of its staff. And Klaas later became well known for his role in the anti-apartheid struggle. I'm very happy that you're here tonight. And the AAC once also had late Vernie February among our staff. He was a scholar, but also very much a poet. And I end with reading one of his poems in his book of poems, O Snotverdriet. It's a very brief poem. It's published in 1979. Ik had een traan in jouw bruin oog gezien. Toe omgedraai, die vrijheid en die hartzeer in. And now I would like to give the floor to Ineke. Dit eventjes ophangen.
Well, thank you, Tom, for this very welcoming introduction. My contribution is largely a PowerPoint presentation, and it will deal with the making of Nelson Mandela, the construction of an icon. And here I have listed the authors from whose work I have borrowed quite heavily. What you see here is a statue under construction of Nelson Mandela in Den Haag, unveiled last year. Nelson Mandela as the elder statesman. And this one is a doll made of beads at Johannesburg International Airport. This is Mandela as your favorite grandfather, a cuddly teddy bear. These images, the elder statesman and the benign grandfather, have come to dominate public imagination in recent years. Thus, Mandela has become a universal hero, but he has also been rendered harmless. Looking back over Mandela's long life, there has been a broad repertoire of images. The freedom fighter, the terrorist, the black nationalist, lawyer, communist, liberal democrat, the great conciliator, the statesman, and the last great moral icon of the 20th century. And here you see this long repertoire already looming over the classroom in the Transkei. How did Nelson Mandela become the undisputed leader of the freedom struggle, and subsequently a universal icon, a symbol of the struggle for justice and reconciliation? And why Nelson Mandela? Why not Walter Sisulu, or Oliver Tambo, or another leading light of the liberation movement? The ANC has a long history of collective leadership and decision-making by consensus. Focusing on Mandela as the public face of the ANC was in breach of a time-honored tradition. Why does everyone, from presidents, queens, pop stars to white Afrikaners, want to be photographed with Nelson Mandela? What made this boy from a modest background in a rural village into a universal icon, a cosmic hero? In my attempts to find an answer, I've borrowed heavily from other authors. Elke Beumer, one of Mandela's many biographers, points at the cultural context. Mandela's political triumph coincided with the international consolidation of, and I quote, the celebrity culture that marks the new millennium, with its focus on the individual as maker of their destiny. The individual as maker of his own destiny. That resonates with Mandela's own favorite quote from a Victorian English poet. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. His life story is a lifelong effort to gain and maintain control over his situation. He was a control freak, always focused on being in charge. Mandela meant and means different things to different people. This repertoire of roles is evident in different phases of history, but he has also played some of his roles simultaneously, targeting different audiences. In mastering all of these different roles, Mandela benefited from early childhood experience. He grew up in an aristocratic setting at the court of the Tambo regent in the Transkei, and he received his education in Victorian mission boarding schools. These rather different environments emphasized very similar virtues. Control your emotions, don't show weakness, observe the courtesies and formalities, keep some distance, and above all, discipline. The South African government portrayed Nelson Mandela and his fellow prisoners as terrorists and communists. This is a recent website of the Herstichte Nationale Partij, and nowadays the Herstichte Nationale Partij belongs to the right-wing fringe. But these images used to be current fare in mainstream white South Africa. This government campaign also had a wider international impact. It was only in 2008, 3 weeks before his 90th birthday, that the name of Nelson Mandela was scrapped from the list of terrorism suspects who were declared prohibited immigrants in the United States. Mandela himself is often seen as the mastermind behind the construction of the iconic Nelson Mandela, the lionized king. However, apart from the mastermind, who was, after all, behind bars, external agents were needed to give this breathtaking performer a world stage. And here the role of the British anti-apartheid movement and the ANC in exile has been crucial. Initially, the anti-apartheid movement campaigned for the release of political prisoners in general. But from 1978, the focus shifts to Nelson Mandela, who was now portrayed as the leader of South Africa's liberation movement. To counteract Pretoria's propaganda, in which Mandela was portrayed as a terrorist and a communist, the anti-apartheid movement built up Mandela's image as an intelligent and rational human being, a victim of an unjust system, rather than a perpetrator of crimes against the state. Subsequently, the campaign for the release of Nelson Mandela was taken up by a South African newspaper, the Sunday Post. The newspaper, in 1980, began a petition for Mandela's release and was subsequently banned. The anti-apartheid movement was highly successful in its attempt to build a broad alliance around this campaign, which included not only politicians of the left, but also conservatives, church leaders, and artists. From 1980, it became a deliberate policy of the ANC in exile to build Mandela as the public face of the ANC. It was a most effective public relations strategy. Free all political prisoners now became Free Nelson Mandela and all other political prisoners. And here you see a whole series of posters from the 1980s. This is Mandela depicted as the South African Che Guevara, as the guerrilla leader, the rebel. We'll see a few more of these. Here is also a quite militant Free Mandela poster. Here, Free Nelson Mandela and all other South African political prisoners. This one the same. This is also the rebel type, the guerrilla leader, with his armed followers in the background. This image, the Che Guevara, appealed to revolutionaries and to radical youth. To make Mandela respectable among the power holders in Washington, London, and other Western capitals, he was now represented as the elder statesman, the liberal democrat, the champion of human rights. This is a very different image, the elder statesman. Another elder statesman. It was, however, not a quick fix. A Free Mandela concert in London in 1983 to celebrate Mandela's 65th birthday was attended by some 3,000 people. 5 years later, the anti-apartheid movement organized the Freedom at 70 campaign, which massively popularized the face of Nelson Mandela. The Mandela tribute concert in Wembley Stadium was sold out, with 60,000 people attending the live event, which was also broadcast worldwide by the BBC. Millions of people all over the world watched the event. This campaign succeeded in recreating the image of Nelson Mandela as a rational, forgiving figure, a man of royal lineage with a degree in law, as well as elevating Mandela to a position of undisputed leadership on the world scene and inside South Africa. The anti-apartheid movement started the business of making Mandela into a successful brand name, with songs, T-shirts, buttons. By the late 1980s, Mandela had been transformed into a universal hero with messiah-like dimensions. The song Free Nelson Mandela made the top of the hit parade, and Jos Damen shortly will give us a few more details about this famous song. In the course of a long life, Nelson Mandela has indeed performed in many different roles. Here, this is a postcard of the International Defense and Aid Fund, and you see him in various capacities. He was a black intellectual, a lawyer, a politician. He was also an eloquent representative of the small black elite. In Drum magazine in the 1950s, Nelson and Winnie figured prominently in the society news. Elegantly dressed, the perfect role model for the African urban professional. Mandela went to prison as member of the collective leadership of the ANC. He was accused number 1, but he was not yet the face of the liberation struggle. 27 years later, he emerged as the undisputed leader, hailed by many as the Messiah, or at the very least a new Moses, who would deliver them from the evils of apartheid. Prison was a crucial phase in the transformation of Nelson Mandela from an impatient, somewhat conceited, sometimes arrogant African nationalist leader to the universally acclaimed hero who no longer needed to impress people because he exuded a natural authority. In prison, a leader can do no wrong. No ill judgment, no weakness, no dubious friends. The imprisoned leader is a blank. The outside world can project a range of different images onto this blank space. The image of Saint Nelson fits with the last phase of his public life. Mandela became an international icon in the 1980s, but it was only in the late 1980s that he was cast in the role of a secular saint, a redeemer of not only South Africa, but all of mankind. The history of the liberation struggle is often told in a biblical mode, as if the actors act out a preordained chain of events unfolding as a tale of destiny. First, there is the phase of revelation, when leaders decide to devote their life to the struggle for justice. And here you see Mandela packing his suitcase, leaving the Transkei for Johannesburg. Now, in fact, he was leaving to escape from a prearranged marriage, but it fits much better to see this as a fulfilling his destiny. Then there is the phase of struggle, of acquiring your followers, of building your movement, followed by number 3, the inevitable times of trial and suffering in the wilderness, but also maturing and growing into the role, and ultimately culminating in redemption, in deliverance from evil. The basic pattern, of course, is Moses leads his people from Egypt through the desert towards the promised land. And this is a pattern that you find as a ground pattern in many liberation histories. These biblical images are quite striking, but also a bit out of tune. Mandela himself has never shown any religious inspiration, and he himself never used biblical phrases. Others did, notably Oliver Tambo, who in his youth wanted to become an Anglican minister. But for Mandela, reconciliation was a political strategy, more than a moral imperative. As one of his associates once said, you're never quite sure whether he is a saint or a Machiavelli. In 1960, the ANC and other South African liberation movements were declared banned organizations. In South Africa, it was prohibited to publish pictures of the ANC leadership. Their speeches and publications were also banned as the South African government tried to erase the ANC from the collective memory of Black South Africa. And this explains why many images of Mandela do not resemble the real-life person. In the absence of photographs, people made up their own image. On the very few pictures taken on Robben Island, Mandela is not always recognizable, as in this picture labeled a prisoner in the garden. And when Mandela finally emerged from prison in 1990, he looked rather different from the man on the posters. Coming back to my original question, why Nelson Mandela? In the 1950s, British journalist and later Mandela biographer Anthony Sampson, the author of Long Walk to Freedom, Anthony Sampson published a book on the treason trial, the mass trial against the ANC leadership and its allies, who stood accused of high treason. In this book, Sampson presents the profiles of the most influential African leaders of this period: Chief Albert Luthuli, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo. Mandela did not figure in this leadership gallery, as Sampson deemed him too hot-tempered, too much of a womanizer, and a dandy. 4 decades later, Sampson became the author of Mandela's authorized biography. And meanwhile, Mandela had been elevated to the status of a secular saint. The campaigns to build Mandela as the face of the liberation struggle nationally and internationally were extremely successful. And this resulted in a reversal of roles. Mandela in prison was a more powerful symbol than Mandela as a free politician. Pretoria came to realize that there would be only one thing worse than a free Mandela, and that was a dead Mandela. If the venerated leader would die in jail, waves of uncontrollable anger would sweep over South Africa. once he was out of jail, he would be cut down to size as an ordinary human being, making mistakes and blunders like everybody else. Now, this did not quite happen. Mandela, as a political leader in the 1990s, surely made mistakes, but this hardly affected his standing in South Africa and the world. To quote Tom Lodge, one of his other famous biographers, few third world insurgencies managed to combine in their leadership such an effective mixture of guerrilla glamour and reassuring metropolitan respectability. The revolutionary rebel was as much part of his repertoire as the perfect British gentleman. Mandela, revered among black South Africans as the commander of armed resistance, received a red carpet welcome in the White House, Buckingham Palace, and Huis ten Bosch. Much of white South Africa was also captured by Mandela's charismatic personality. Afrikaners in particular embraced him as a father figure, as he reached out to them with all kinds of symbolic gestures, giving recognition to heroes from the Boer War and celebrating their heroes on the rugby field. His biographers have characterized him as a paradox. The militant freedom fighter who became the embodiment of compromise, consensus, and reconciliation. The African nationalist embraced by the world as a symbol of a universal humanism. The world is in need of moral authority, and Mandela was the perfect person to fill the need for celebrities with moral authority. With his considerable talent for acting, he played his roles convincingly. As his American ghostwriter Richard Stengel concluded, the man and the myth became indistinguishable. Mandela lived his public personality, which left him very little space for any kind of private life. Inevitably, filling Mandela's shoes has been a challenge for his successors in the presidency. The Rainbow Nation is tarnished by all kinds of troubles and tribulations. The tragic events in August last year at the Marikana mine were the worst bloodbath since the ANC came to power in 1994. However, whatever happens to South Africa, this seems unlikely to have an impact on Nelson Mandela's standing in South Africa and in the wider world. Thank you.
The next one in line is Jos. Jos is our Deputy Director of the African Studies Center, and he loves songs, at least some of them. Thank you. A warm welcome to you all who had the courage to come to this celebration and a remembrance of Nelson Mandela. I was a student at Leiden University at the end of the 70s, and I like British pop rock, like Elvis Costello and the Attractions, Iron Jury and the Blockheads, and this, the specials. Will be there. To Rudy. This one. Only 3 seconds. Why did I like the specials? Because they were multiracial, because they were funny, because they sang about the things that mattered for a 20-year-old, like sex and politics, especially like Ghost Town in the Thatcher area. And look at the guy who is the guy over there, playing the piano, well, attempting to play the piano. His name was Jerry Demas, and he was, in fact, one of the leaders of the specials. He went to a concert, a festival in Alexandra Palace in London on 18 July 1983, a concert that Ineke just mentioned, 3,000 people attending. What had a good lineup: Julian Bahula, Hugh Masekela, Osiba from Ghana. And he had never heard of Nelson Mandela before. And he had a song in his head, only 3 notes, C-A-E. And he was impressed by what he heard about Nelson Mandela. So he went home and he wrote a song. There are several, but I know all versions. I need the rehearsal. This is the one. Here's the guy with no teeth. Pretending to write it now, of course he didn't, but I'll show you only 2 minutes of this, because it's the original version, very slow, 8 minutes 53 seconds long. This guy was later convicted. Then Elvis Costello comes in. A cappella song, more African, more upbeat. And I'll wait for a minute. Watch the girl on the left. The girl on the left is rode at a car. She wrote one line: "One man in a large army So free Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners. What Jerry Dammers didn't know was that the concert he was watching, Festival of African Sounds in the Alexandra Palace, was in fact part of the ANC's and the anti-apartheid movement campaign to focus on Mandela as one of the political prisoners that had to be released. Archbishop Trevor Huddleston was one of the campaigners, and Jerry just fit in right well. He didn't know that, but he was in deep trouble. He had a debt of, I think, £200,000 to his record company because he was making this record, of which Free Nelson Mandela is part. Oh, sorry. Was making this record. And so he never earned 1 penny from the song, but he did a nice work. The song was an immediate success in beginning of 1984, March 1984. Number 9 in the English charts, number 1 in the New Zealand charts, very high in the Netherlands and in Germany. And it gave Jerry Dammers the opportunity to do other things. He had a song about starvation in Africa in 1985, and in 1986 a completely year was used by him to work on the Artists United Against Apartheid, and he asked a few bands to play on a gig. It didn't succeed well. Then he joined the movement to have the concert in Wembley, 1982, the 70-year concert organized. And this was not only commercially a large success. Sting, George Michael, Dire Straits, Richard Gere introduced some bands. Stevie Wonder, Simple Minds, Peter Gabriel, Miriam Makeba, Salif Keita, Youssou N'Dour. Well, I could go on with 20 other names. 60,000 people attending, Ineke rightly said so, but 600 million people watching on television. And my point is that I think this song was instrumental in influencing not only public opinion, but also support South Africans. Many South Africans were singing the song at ANC meetings. And not only public opinion, but also have a positive effect on the attitude of Western governments. Mandela was moved to a more comfortable Victor Verster prison in December 1988, and of course released in February 1990, and the rest is history. If you would like to see a small tribute to Jerry Dammers, go watch at the end of December Dutch television. The Top 2000 Agogo has a small item, a few minutes, about Jerry Dammers, this song, and his tribute to Free Nelson Mandela. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jos.
So nice to be a librarian, isn't it? We'll continue with Harry Wells, who will share with us some of his views about what next.
Friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honored, but also slightly overwhelmed to be asked to speak at this gathering to commemorate the life of Nelson Mandela. I will never be able to do justice to him or what he meant for South Africa and the world at large. So please forgive me. In one respect, being asked to talk about South Africa's future after Nelson Mandela is easy, as no one can predict the future with certainty or evidence. But it is also extremely difficult, as so many contextual factors need to be taken into account. Nelson Mandela was a moral giant, and this has been mentioned many times in the last few days, years, decades. He was an activist, a prisoner, and a president. And more than anyone else, he provided South Africa with moral leadership. Tonight we are going to look to the future and ask whether Mandela's moral leadership and example will continue to shape South Africa in a positive way. Is moral leadership sustainable? Can his exemplary leadership survive the political rat race that is expected in the country's elections next year? Let me put it another way. Can democracy survive without moral leadership? There's always a danger of being or becoming over-emotional on a topic like this, or of being religious to the point of becoming evangelical and moralistic. And I am in danger of being seen as too naive and unrealistic. I think I am truly in danger of being called all of these. But if there is ever an occasion for this kind of reflection, it is at a time of remembrance like this for a man like Nelson Mandela. One of our Dutch national newspapers published a cartoon this week showing Fokke and Sukke standing at the gates to heaven and telling Jesus to step to one side because Nelson Mandela was coming. South Africa, as we have seen already, has its own razor-sharp Sapiro, who maybe sometimes sails too close to the wind. We are happy in the Netherlands that we have Fokke and Sukke to fulfill that role. And actually, I don't know the exact English word for oppoepelen. I'm sorry about that. Ladies and gentlemen, this week seems like a liminal phase. There is a South Africa before Mandela's death and one afterwards. And we are now in between these two phases, a kind of betwixt and between. Liminal. Liminal times and spaces are ideally suited for messages of faith, hope, and love. And I remember very clearly one of my first encounters with the concept of liminality when I was studying anthropology in my first year at university. We were discussing pilgrimages and how they could be instances of liminal time and space where everyone, the rich and the poor, men and women, the young and the old, the handicapped and the able-bodied people, blacks and whites, and all the other labels that create divisions in everyday life, temporarily disappear for the duration of the event. So the beggar and the rich man can share their sentiments surrounding the pilgrimage, but afterwards, the beggar walks on to an uncertain destination, and the rich man is picked up by his chauffeur in a Jaguar and returns to his villa. They were one during the liminal phase of the pilgrimage, and their differences were not there. It would even possibly have felt as if they hadn't existed before the pilgrimage. And there was the suggestion that they would not return afterwards either. They shared communitas, in the words of anthropologist Victor Turner. I think we are in the middle of such a liminal phase right now. And hugging each other across differences has, if only temporarily, become easy. But what were the lasting effects of the shared pilgrimage on our rich man and our beggar? How did they view and continue to live in the world after the pilgrimage was over? A story like this does not usually provide any answers about that. And maybe we ourselves will have to come up with an answer. What we do know, though, is that liminal times and spaces can bridge diversities, as nothing else can. When the world's leaders and ordinary South Africans gathered in Johannesburg's FNB Stadium yesterday for the memorial to Nelson Mandela, Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned the importance of bridging diversities in his opening speech. What will be the lasting effects of such a liminal phase for South Africa when this week of mourning and remembering is over after Nelson Mandela's funeral service on Sunday? Nelson Mandela's image of moral leadership is based on the role he played and the way he acted when he was released from prison in 1990 and when he became South Africa's first democratically elected black president in 1994. And while many expected bloodshed or even outright civil war, Mandela was able to prevent this by embracing policies of reconciliation as the way forward for South Africa as a people and as a nation. He framed his reconciliatory approach by asking Archbishop Tutu to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, TRC in short. Desmond Tutu, being an activist like Mandela, but one who stuck to peaceful and non-violent tactics, became the embodiment of the Rainbow Nation, partly, I suspect, because of his contagious chuckle. I can't imitate that either. No, I won't. Much could be said about the TRC's flaws and compromises, but, ladies and gentlemen, it made a powerful statement at the time about the idea of reconciliation that Nelson Mandela had for the nation. In popular culture too, Mandela embraced reconciliation, perhaps most powerfully and symbolically during the Rugby World Cup in 1995, when he asked the nation to support the national rugby team, the Springboks. He himself attended the finals wearing a Springbok shirt, which had been a hated symbol of white supremacy in the past. The Springboks won, miraculously, and every South African celebrated and hugged each other. The movie Invictus showed the power of this symbolism, both in a heartwarming but also slightly sentimental way. This contrasts sharply with the undignified and shameful way that Sepp Blatter tried to draw symbolic capital from his powerful position as chairman of FIFA and his meetings with Nelson Mandela about South Africa's bid for the World Cup that was held in South Africa in 2010. His abuse and lack of empathy for the liminal phase we are currently in became painfully clear at this week's draw for the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, where his minute of silence to honor his friend Nelson Mandela ended after only counted 11 seconds. Never try to be too efficient when it comes to liminal time. Another aspect of Mandela's moral leadership was that he was never negative about the language of his former oppressors. He spoke Afrikaans and, as many of you here tonight will know, he chose to include Ingrid Jonker's beautiful poem, The Child, originally written in Afrikaans, in his maiden speech to South Africa's new parliament in May 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm trying to stress is that probably none of us has to be convinced that Nelson Mandela's leadership can be labeled as moral. The overall label even seems to hold, while he allowed ugly violence to become part of the struggle at some stage in his opposition to apartheid. And while he hid the fact that he was member of the South African Communist Party, it was already mentioned, as my colleague Stephen Ellis has convincingly shown. It holds in the knowledge that he was a womanizer and loved expensive clothes, and that his personality was also to a large extent formatted by an explicit strategy that consciously constructed him as an icon, as Ineke van Kessel so powerfully argued just now. Nevertheless, Nelson Mandela can truly be labeled a moral leader. I would further like to highlight this by referring to two important ideas about morality that I think are worth considering in the current context of South Africa. One is the notion by the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida. It's my only French, by the way. He speaks of the contamination of oppositional pairs and indicates that in the process of opposing a particular wrong, the opposition itself becomes contaminated by the cause and the opponents that are contested. And the opponents, to a certain extent, themselves become what they so vehemently oppose. This is not to argue that today's ANC has become exactly like the former apartheid government, or has become even worse than its predecessor, as the former ANC Youth League leader Julius Malema is suggesting. But fact seems to be that many of the moral ideas of 1994 seem to have evaporated since the democratic transition. And Nelson Mandela was part of this process and of the inevitable continuities that there are between the apartheid government and the ANC regime. Continuities that are suggested by the very notion of the contamination of oppositional pairs. Mandela strongly believed in education as a way to freedom, justice, and equality for all. He himself led by example and never stopped studying, even during his years in prison. Today, ladies and gentlemen, education is at an all-time low in South Africa. How, for example, can school books fail to arrive for a whole year in Limpopo province? There are roads, there is transport, there is GPS. What can ultimately be so difficult about delivering textbooks? Jonathan Jansen, probably one of the fiercest critics of the South African government on education, warns of an implosion of democracy if the crisis in education is not dealt with appropriately and quickly. Focusing on maths, and I quote here from a newspaper article on his public lecture at the Helen Suzman Foundation in 2012, he, and I quote, compared the government's approach to the need to improve maths in schools as the same as that under apartheid. And he's noted to say, neither Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, nor the current Minister of Education believe that a black child can excel in mathematics. End of quote. Is this a contamination of oppositional pairs? How else can we explain the strikingly similar stereotypes about being black and being able to master maths? For many people, and it was already mentioned before, the massacre of protesting miners in Marikana in August last year was a vivid reminder of events and policies in the worst apartheid years. Filmmaker Rehad Desai speaks of damning evidence, and I quote, which showed, in his opinion, that the police had not only engineered the situation, which led to the miners being shot, but had then lied repeatedly to the South African public and the inquiry to cover up their actions. End of quote. And the way the government dealt with striking farm labourers in the Western Cape last year showed similar traces of the contamination of oppositional pairs. A declaration sent to the government by the Centre of African Studies at the University of Cape Town on behalf of social movements protesting current land policies in South Africa got lost, and after being resent has remained unanswered to this day. Protests directed at any level of government seem to fall on deaf ears, which remind us of tactics used by the apartheid regime. It could perhaps be argued that 19 years into South Africa's democracy, there is no longer any moral high ground to be taken by anyone. Complicity at all levels and by everyone, former oppressors as well as its former opponents, may well be a key to understanding today's South Africa. If we let this analysis sink in for a moment, it may help in thinking about the way forward. In a provocative article by South African philosopher Samantha Weiss from Rhodes University in Grahamstown, she urges us to go beyond our egos and pride and to embrace humbleness, shame, and silence. Living from such a shared perspective of complicities that leads to humbleness encourages me to see a different future and one where there will be more tolerance for each other. If we recognize that we share the burden and responsibility for the current situation, we might as well accept that we are in the same boat when it comes to building a common future. But thinking about South Africa's future in terms of complicities and asking for tolerance will not suffice. Far from it, I would argue. And I would like to refer here to a recent book by the famous sociologist Sigmund Bauman and Leonidas Donskis called Moral Blindness, the Loss of Sensitivity in Liquid Modernity. According to them, our highly institutionalized present needs to take a closer look at what institutional power does to people and what becomes of them in the process of institutionalization. This perspective can be applied to what has been happening to the ANC and its power holders since they acquired a majority position in South Africa in 1994. Bauman and Donskis' analysis summarizes what I have been trying to argue with my earlier examples from South Africa. And let me quote from their book. Memory becomes a tool of the small and weak, while forgetting serves the interests of the big and mighty. In this way, memory manifests itself as an alternative moral imagination in opposition to the logic of power. Institutional power, ladies and gentlemen, tends to forget as a manifestation of its powers, while the less powerful keep often painful memories alive. And South Africa testifies to that. In the process, a moral imagination of the future is created. Ignoring the protest in the Western Cape and what happened in the Marikana massacre, the lost declaration, the missing school books, all adds up in the memories of the small and weak, to use Bauman and Donskis' word once again. Forgetting about them is for the big and mighty ANC bosses in government. Ladies and gentlemen, where does this take us concerning Nelson Mandela's moral leadership and what it might mean for the future of South Africa? I think it leads me, at least, to bet on the small and weak. In other words, on ordinary South Africans who can remember and have a moral imagination for a better future. I remember the words of Desmond Tutu, who at yesterday's FNB Stadium said that we should never underestimate ordinary South Africans. And he voiced the hope and expectation that they will promise and will take up what Nelson Mandela has left for them to do. And I could hear a clear hallelujah and amen from Cyril Ramaphosa, interestingly enough. Nelson Mandela belonged to the big and mighty, but never forgot where he came from and always remembered the times when the ANC and its supporters were considered small and weak. It was a time when the ANC cherished the moral imagination of a better future that would come with the biblical notion of being small and weak. If we reflect for a moment on this notion, it could well mean that Jesus and Mandela both deserve a place in heaven. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. Now it's time for a poem. Karina, you're reading it? A poet?
Thank you.
Will I hold it for you? Maybe.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start my poem, just a few words of introduction. About the picture behind me. Yes. Thank you. This picture is taken in Lesotho, in the Malutis, of a donkey running away. And this donkey became a metaphor of myself. A donkey running away. In the poem, I just want to explain 4 words. Firstly, in the name, Dorcas vir Mandela. The name Dorcas is actually from the Bible, and to be precisely or exactly from Act 9, verse 36, where the name of the woman Tabitha is changed into Dorcas. The name Dorcas became a favorite name for servants in the Afrikaans households. And that is also the case, I think, in England, as I hear from my friends out there. Another word, muti, means medicine. The words mutu kimutu kabatu means a human is a human through other human beings. And the word abba means to carry someone on your back. Okay. Enough. Dorcas vir Mandela. Belydenis en lof. Ek was die donkie met oogklappe aan. Gemuilband deur 'n verhaal oor die volk van God, het die woord kaffer spontaan uit my mond gegroei. Met dorings en distels wat geil en hardnekkig gebloei het. Winkelhake deur weggooi klere en ooptoon skoene geskeur het. Sondag is ek gestorie. Dik gevreet aan soetkoek, kon ek tuis wegkyk vir die dorings van middagete uit 'n gechipte blikbord eet. Wegkyk vir die distels van flou koue koffie uit 'n afoorbeker drink. Selde of ooit het ek opstandig gebalk oor tallose klappe teen kake of gebloei oor die geskater agter boelterrier se hakskeen buite. My kop het ek 2 dosyn male teen dieselfde klippe gestamp. Toe weggehardloop met my lewe in 'n streepsak suiker op my rug. Die bagasie van apartheid is saam agter my oogklappe. Ek het nouliks geweet van hulle helder geleerde man, wat geweier het om in gelid te loop met 'n blaffende sepier, en die rook van gebrande bande en traangas en opslagkoels geabsorbeer het, vir elke slegs blankes bank in elke park, en elke slegs blankes toilet, slegs blankes astrom, slegs blankes padblokkade, slegs blankes Kasper. Kaalvoet was hy in 'n kalkgroef op 'n verlate eiland, so godverlate soos ons Myndorp se strate na 6 in die aand, wanneer die werkers se pastyd vir die dag verby was. Hy wat dag in dag uit, maand in maand uit, jaar in jaar uit klippe moes kap, tot sy hande en sy rug krom gekramp en sy oë sonder oogklappe gesweer het, van te veel wit. Die donkie met die ingeperkte blik, die oorwoekerde tong, het stil geleer by die verdwaalde dorkasse van haar taal, en geluister hoe hulle woorde soos goeie saad in harte plant, soms met 'n gedig soos 'n verdwaalkoel die kaalvoetman tref alleen in die stofwolk van die groef, en die steen in sy hart splyt. Ek moes leer om skerp te kyk, my woorde te tel en te swyg. Nou is ek die Dorcas uit 'n tweede werpsel van apartheid. Ek het die muilband gebreek, 11.000 kilometer ver weggehardloop, bloeiend en loeiend en balkend en verskrik, gekwes, gevaarlik soos 'n halfgeleerde Afrikaner met sterk verhale, van God verlate onder hierdie grauwit hemel, moes ek leer van die lang grys kaalvoetman se sterk medisyne. Ubuntu het ek gevreet soos pille teen die haak en steekbos van boikot agterdog. Ubuntu het ek gesluk vir die vergeet van die dorings en distels wat Fort Europa beskerm. Wegkyk van my as verdagte Dorcas met 'n dun soel droom. Ubuntu was daar die langgrys man se onverdunde moetie, verstadig gesond word met motu, kimutu, kabatu. Dorcas kom nou met goud en wierook en mirre uit die weste, ontydig laat en vertwyfeld met haar dankie sê vir sy alles weet, niks vergeet en tog vergeef, want Ubuntu hou haar staande teen die noorderlinge met hulle koel berekende bloed in die are. En Dorcas buk voor die man met sy deurleefde wysheid, onwaardig om hom te abba na die een of ander nuwe Jerusalem